The rain hammered against my BMW's windshield as I sat in the parking lot of the Grandview Hotel, watching the entrance with predatory patience. My hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, though every muscle in my body was coiled like a spring. After all, patience had always been my greatest strength, and soon it would become my most devastating weapon. 3 months. 3 months since I'd first noticed the subtle changes in my fiancée Victoria. The way she'd started checking her phone obsessively, the mysterious late-night meetings at the bank, the careful way she'd begun distancing herself from me emotionally, while still playing the loving bride-to-be. But suspicion wasn't enough. I'd needed concrete proof before I could act, and now I finally had it. My phone buzzed with a text from the private investigator I'd hired. "Package delivered to your office. Everything you requested is there." I'd seen enough for tonight. Victoria's silver Porsche had been parked outside the hotel for over 2 hours, and I'd watched my business partner, my supposed best friend since college, walk through the same entrance 43 minutes later. James Richardson, the man who'd stood beside me when we'd built Richardson and Kane Securities from nothing into a multi-million-dollar empire. The man who was supposed to be my best man in 6 weeks. The man who is currently upstairs in room 412, fucking the woman I'd planned to marry, while discussing how they were going to kill me. Because that's what this was really about. Not just infidelity, murder. I'd overheard enough of their conversation last week to understand that I wasn't just being betrayed, I was being eliminated. The company, the money, the properties, they wanted it all, and I was simply an obstacle to be removed. What Victoria and James didn't realize was that I'd been recording everything since that night. And what they really didn't know was that Alexander Kane, the legitimate businessman, was only half the story. The other half was something far more dangerous than they could imagine, period. My phone rang, the distinctive ringtone making me smile for the first time in weeks. The caller ID simply read Uncle Victor, though the relationship was more complicated than that. "Likesen," came the gravelly voice, speaking in Russian. "I hear you have troubles with your American associates." Viktor Kozlov had earned the title of uncle through blood spilled rather than blood shared. He was also the head of the most powerful criminal organization on the East Coast, and the man who'd taken me in 20 years ago after my parents were murdered by a rival family. "Nothing I can't handle," I replied, starting the BMW's engine. "Of course not. You are family, even if you prefer expensive suits to traditional methods." His laugh carried the weight of decades in the shadows. "But remember, blood calls to blood. Your cousin Mikhail is available if you need his particular skills." "I appreciate the offer, Uncle, but this requires a personal touch." "As you wish, but when you grow tired of playing the respectable businessman, there is always a place for you at the table." After hanging up, I studied my reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back at me belonged to Alexander Kane, Harvard MBA, successful entrepreneur, pillar of the community. But beneath that carefully constructed facade, something much older and infinitely more dangerous was awakening. The boy who'd watched his father's enemies torture information out of his mother before executing them both had never really disappeared. He'd simply learned to wear better masks. I'd spent 15 years building a legitimate empire, burying my family's legacy so deep that I'd almost convinced myself it didn't matter anymore. But Victoria and James had made one catastrophic miscalculation. They'd threatened everything I'd worked for, and there was nothing in this world more lethal than a Kozlov protecting what belonged to him. The Richardson and Kane building stood empty at midnight, its glass facade reflecting the city lights like a monument to what I'd thought was our shared success. I used my private elevator to reach the executive floor, my footsteps echoing in the silence as I made my way to my corner office. The package from my investigator sat on my desk like a judgment waiting to be rendered. Inside, I found photographs that made my jaw clench, financial documents that painted a picture of systematic theft, phone transcripts that revealed the depth of their conspiracy, and a flash drive containing audio recordings that would have impressed even Uncle Victor's most paranoid security chief. As I spread the evidence across my desk, the true scope of their betrayal became clear. This wasn't some passionate affair that had spiraled out of control. It was a calculated, long-term operation designed to strip me of everything I'd built. James had been systematically moving our highest-value clients to shell companies he'd established over the past 18 months. Victoria had been using her senior position at Manhattan First National to facilitate complex wire transfers and create false documentation to hide the money trail. Together, they'd stolen over $57 million from the company and were planning their final act, my murder, during what was supposed to be my bachelor party in Las Vegas next weekend. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. A staged accident during a private jet flight that would leave no survivors and no questions. But the most damning piece of evidence was a recording of James discussing cleanup with someone whose voice I didn't recognize. The insurance policies are substantial enough to cover any investigation. Once Alexander is dead, Victoria inherits as his fiancée, and I inherit as his business partner. We liquidate everything within 6 months and disappear to the Cayman Islands. Clean, simple, permanent. I leaned back in my leather chair, processing the magnitude of their betrayal. They'd been so careful, so methodical. Under normal circumstances, their plan might have actually succeeded. But they'd made one fundamental error in judgment. They'd assumed I was nothing more than the legitimate businessman I appeared to be. I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in 5 years. "Mikhail, it's Alex. I need you and 3 of your most reliable men. We have work to do, and it needs to be untraceable." The next morning dawned gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly as I prepared to begin dismantling the lives of the 2 people I'd trusted most in the world. But first, I had to continue playing the role of the unsuspecting victim. I kissed Victoria goodbye at her apartment, noting how she barely met my eyes, and arrived at the office to find James already at his desk, reviewing what I now knew were fraudulent financial projections. He said with the easy smile that had once made me consider him a brother, "Ready for Vegas next weekend?" "Looking forward to it," I replied, matching his false enthusiasm. "It'll be good to get away from all this stress." If only he knew how prophetic those words would prove to be. My first move was surgical in its precision. I called an emergency board meeting for that afternoon, informing our 5-member board of directors that I discovered serious irregularities in our accounts that required immediate attention. These were men who'd known me since the company's founding, who trusted my judgment implicitly, and who had no reason to suspect that their faith in me was about to be weaponized. "Gentlemen," I began, standing at the head of the polished conference table with the evidence arranged before me like an indictment. "What I'm about to show you will be difficult to process, but I need you to understand the gravity of our situation." I presented the financial documents methodically, watching their expressions shift from confusion to disbelief to grim anger as they realized what James had been doing. The phone transcripts were damning enough, but the recordings were devastating. By the time I'd finished my presentation, the temperature in the room had dropped 20 degrees. "Jesus Christ," whispered Robert Chen, our longest-serving board member. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 18 months, possibly longer. James has been very careful to cover his tracks." "What do you want us to do?" asked Margaret Torres, our chief financial oversight officer. "Nothing yet. If we move too quickly, he'll disappear with whatever money he hasn't already transferred offshore. I need you to authorize a forensic audit of all company accounts, but keep it absolutely quiet. As far as James knows, everything is normal. And then, we destroy him so completely that prison will seem like mercy." The board voted unanimously to give me unlimited authority to handle the situation. Within an hour, I'd frozen all company accounts that James had access to, initiated investigations with both the FBI and the Securities Exchange Commission, and begun the process of tracing every dollar he'd stolen. But financial justice wasn't enough, not nearly enough. My second call was to Victoria's supervisor at Manhattan First National. It's remarkable how cooperative banking executives become when presented with detailed evidence that one of their senior officers has been facilitating wire fraud and money laundering on an international scale, particularly when that evidence comes with the subtle suggestion that federal regulators might be very interested in the bank's oversight procedures. Within 2 hours, Victoria was suspended pending an internal investigation. Her access to all banking systems was revoked, and federal agents were requesting copies of every transaction she'd authorized in the past 2 years. Her carefully constructed financial house of cards was already beginning to collapse, though she didn't know it yet. But I was just getting started. That evening, I arrived at Victoria's upscale apartment carrying champagne and dinner from Chez Laurent, her favorite restaurant. The doorman greeted me with his usual deference. After all, I was the successful businessman who would soon be his tenant's husband. If only he knew what I was really there to do. Alex! Victoria opened the door, and I immediately noticed the strain around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. I thought you were working late tonight. I was, but I wanted to surprise you. I stepped inside, noting how she remained by the door, as if ready to flee. I heard about the situation at the bank. I know how stressful this must be for you. It's just a misunderstanding, she said quickly, her voice pitched slightly higher than normal. Some accounting discrepancies in one of the international departments. Nothing to do with me directly. I'm sure the investigation will clear everything up. I set the food on her granite countertop and turned to embrace her, feeling how rigidly she held herself against me. But I thought we could use some time together. Just us. As we ate dinner by candlelight, I watched her struggle to maintain the facade of normalcy. She kept checking her phone compulsively, undoubtedly waiting for updates from James about their deteriorating situation. What she didn't know was that James was currently in a soundproof room in an abandoned warehouse in Queens, having a very educational conversation with Mikhail about the consequences of betraying family. Not to worry, Mikhail had strict instructions not to kill him. Yet, that particular pleasure was reserved for me, and I intended to savor every moment of it. Alex, Victoria said suddenly, reaching across the small table to grasp my hand with fingers that trembled slightly. I love you. You know that, right? No matter what happens, no matter what you might hear about me, I need you to know that everything I've done has been for us. Of course I know that. I lifted her hand to my lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Why would you say something like that? No reason. Sometimes I worry that you don't understand how much you mean to me. Then show me, I said, my voice dropping to the intimate tone that had never failed to affect her. What followed was perhaps the most intense night of passion we'd ever shared. Victoria made love to me with a desperation that bordered on violence, clinging to me as if I were the only solid thing in a world that was crashing down around her. And in a sense, I suppose I was, though not in the way she imagined. As she lay sleeping in my arms afterward, her auburn hair spread across my chest like spilled blood. I stared at the ceiling and finalized the details of what would happen next. Tomorrow, Victoria and James would begin to understand what it truly meant to betray someone with Kozlov blood in their veins. They would learn that there are fates far worse than death, and that I had both the patience and the resources to ensure they experienced every one of them. I left Victoria's apartment before dawn, slipping out while she was still lost in exhausted sleep. She looked peaceful lying there, almost innocent, and for a brief moment I felt something that might have been regret. But then I remembered her voice on that recording. Eliminate the problem, and any trace of mercy died stillborn. The warehouse in Queens sat in an industrial district that the city had forgotten, surrounded by the bones of businesses that had failed during the last recession. It was the perfect place for the kind of conversation I intended to have with my former best friend. Mikhail had chosen well. I found James in the center of the empty space, secured to a heavy wooden chair with professional-grade restraints. His expensive Armani suit was torn and stained with blood, his usually perfect hair hanging in greasy strands over his swollen face. When he heard my footsteps echoing across the concrete floor, he raised his head with visible effort. Alex, thank God you're here. Relief flooded his voice as he recognized me. These animals kidnapped me from the parking garage at the office. You have to call the police. Actually, I said, pulling up a metal folding chair to sit directly in front of him. I'm the one who told them to bring you here. The relief died instantly, replaced by confusion and the first stirring of real fear. What? I don't understand. Why would you? Because you made a very serious mistake, James. You forgot who you were dealing with. I leaned back casually, as if we were having coffee, instead of the conversation that would determine whether he lived or died. You thought Alexander Kane was weak, soft, someone you could manipulate and dispose of when he became inconvenient. Alex, I swear to God, I don't know what you're talking about. The backhand I delivered across his face was hard enough to split his lip and send blood spattering across his shirt. Don't lie to me. I have recordings of every conversation, copies of every transaction, photographs of every meeting. I know about the stolen money, the shell companies, the plan to murder me in Vegas next week. James's face went ash gray as the full scope of his situation became clear. How did you? When did I find out? 3 months ago. How did I find out? I smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Let's just say, I have resources you never suspected. I stood and walked over to a folding table where Mikhail had arranged various implements with the care of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. I selected a pair of bolt cutters, testing their weight in my hands. You see, James, you were right about one thing. Alexander Kane might have been weak enough to forgive this betrayal, might have been naive enough to believe your apologies and promises to make things right. I turned back to face him, noting how his eyes were fixed on the tool in my hands. But Alexander Kane is only part of who I am. The other part is something you should have investigated more thoroughly before you decided to betray me. What are you talking about? My family name isn't really Kane. It's Kozlov, as in Viktor Kozlov, and the organization that has controlled criminal enterprises from Boston to Miami for the past 30 years. I let that sink in for a moment. I've been living legitimately for 15 years, trying to build something clean and respectable. But you and Victoria threatened everything I worked for, and that awakened something I'd tried very hard to keep buried. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. James had lived in this city long enough to know what the Kozlov name meant. He began hyperventilating, pulling against his restraints with renewed desperation. "Please," he gasped. "Alex, please, you have to understand. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Victoria. She convinced me that you were planning to push me out of the company anyway. She said it was us or you, that we had to act first. So you decided to murder me." I set the bolt cutters back on the table and selected a different tool, something that would be more educational. Not just steal from me, not just betray me, but actually end my life so you could take everything I built. We weren't really going to. The knife found its home in his thigh before he could finish the lie, drawing a scream that echoed off the warehouse walls. I left it there, the handle protruding from his leg like an exclamation point. "I have audio recordings of you discussing the details, James. I know exactly what you were planning." I returned to my chair, ignoring his whimpering. "But here's what's actually going to happen instead. You're going to transfer every stolen dollar back to the company accounts. You're going to provide detailed confessions to the FBI, the SEC, and anyone else I direct you to speak with. You're gonna implicate Victoria completely and provide evidence of every crime you committed together. And if I refuse?" I gestured toward the table of implements. "Then Mikhail and I will spend the next several days exploring just how much physical and psychological trauma the human body can endure before it stops functioning. And James, I've had 15 years to study the subject." He broke completely then, sobbing like a child as he agreed to everything I demanded. Within 2 hours, he provided passwords to offshore accounts, authorized the transfer of $57 million back to Richardson and Kane Securities, and recorded detailed confessions to multiple felonies. He'd also provided evidence that would ensure Victoria received the maximum possible sentence for her role in their conspiracy. I almost felt disappointed by how easily he surrendered. Almost. Agent Sarah Morrison had the kind of sharp, intelligent eyes that missed very little, which is probably why she'd risen to lead the FBI's white-collar crime division in New York. She was waiting in Victoria's apartment when I arrived that evening, along with 2 other agents and Victoria herself, who looked like she'd aged 10 years since I'd left her that morning. "Mr. Kane," Agent Morrison said, rising from Victoria's couch, "thank you for coming. We were hoping to speak with you about some irregularities that have come to our attention regarding your company and your fiancé's activities at Manhattan First National." "Of course, Agent Morrison. I'm happy to help however I can." I moved to Victoria's side, taking her trembling hand in mine. Though I have to say, I'm confused about what Victoria could possibly have to do with any problems at my company. Victoria's eyes were red and swollen from crying, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and desperate. "Alex, they're saying I helped someone steal money for Richardson and Kane. But I swear to you, I would never." "Actually," I interrupted gently, "I think you would." I released her hand and walked to her kitchen counter, where I'd left a manila folder earlier that morning during my staged surprise visit. Inside were copies of bank records, phone transcripts, surveillance photographs, and financial documents that painted a comprehensive picture of her crimes. Victoria's face went white as she realized what she was looking at. "Alex, please, you don't understand." "Don't I?" I kept my voice calm, almost conversational. $57 million, Victoria. 18 months of systematic theft. Partnership with my business associate to defraud our clients and steal everything we built together. I looked up at Agent Morrison. And a plan to murder me to prevent discovery of their crimes. Agent Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Murder? James Richardson confessed everything this morning. I believe you'll find his statement quite comprehensive. I handed her a flash drive. Audio recordings, financial evidence, details of their plan to stage my death during a private flight to Las Vegas next weekend. Mr. Kane, I have to ask, how did you obtain this evidence? Some of these recordings appear to have been made without the subject's knowledge, which raises questions about admissibility. I hired a private investigation firm 3 months ago when I first suspected irregularities in my company's accounts. Everything was obtained legally and is fully documented. I met her gaze steadily. I'm a victim of conspiracy and attempted murder, Agent Morrison. I used every legal resource available to protect myself and gather evidence. It wasn't entirely true, of course, but it was close enough to pass federal scrutiny. The investigation firm had indeed obtained most of the evidence legally. I'd simply supplemented their findings with information gathered through less conventional methods. Victoria was staring at me as if seeing a stranger. Who are you? This isn't the man I fell in love with. You're not capable of this kind of calculation. You're right, I said softly. The man you fell in love with was someone I created to fit into this world. But underneath that persona, I'm still my father's son. And my father taught me never to allow betrayal to go unpunished. Agent Morrison was reviewing the contents of the flash drive on her laptop, her expression growing more grim with each file she opened. Miss Sterling, you're under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and violation of federal banking regulations. As the agents led Victoria away in handcuffs, she turned back to look at me one last time. I loved you, she whispered. No, I replied. You loved what you thought I could give you. You never loved me. After they left, I stood alone in her apartment, surrounded by the remnants of the life I'd built as Alexander Kane. But I wasn't sad. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely at peace. The game was nearly over, and I had won more completely than Victoria and James could have ever imagined. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had seen its share of high-profile cases, but the trial of Victoria Sterling and James Richardson captured the public's imagination in a way that surprised even seasoned court reporters. Socialite banker and business partner conspire to murder tech mogul dominated headlines for months, with every sordid detail of their betrayal splashed across front pages and social media feeds. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row behind the prosecution table, like a grieving victim seeking justice. The media painted me as a tragic figure, the brilliant entrepreneur who'd overcome a troubled childhood to build a legitimate empire, only to be betrayed by the two people he trusted most in the world. It was a beautiful narrative, and it had the additional advantage of being mostly true. Victoria and James's defense teams tried desperately to paint their clients as victims of manipulation, claiming that I had somehow coerced them into their crimes. They hired psychiatrists who testified about coercive control and financial abuse. They brought in character witnesses who spoke about the loving, generous people they'd known before they'd become involved with me. The jury wasn't impressed. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. $57 million in documented theft, recorded conversations planning my murder, financial records showing systematic fraud spanning 18 months. James's own confession, given voluntarily and corroborated by physical evidence that even the most aggressive defense attorney couldn't explain away. When I took the stand to testify, the prosecution walked me through the timeline of discovery with surgical precision. I played the role perfectly, the devastated fiancé who'd gradually realized that the woman he loved was systematically destroying everything he'd worked for. The betrayed friend who discovered that his business partner was planning to murder him. Mr. Kane, the prosecutor asked during my direct examination, how did it feel to learn that the people closest to you were planning to kill you? Devastating, I replied, my voice breaking slightly. Victoria was supposed to be my wife. James was like a brother to me. To discover that they saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to be eliminated, it changed everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty. During cross-examination, Victoria's attorney tried to attack my credibility by questioning how I'd obtained some of the evidence. But I'd been careful to ensure that everything presented in court could be traced to legitimate sources. The illegal surveillance, the coerced confessions, the methods that would have raised uncomfortable questions. None of that made it into the official record. The defense also tried to make an issue of my family background, suggesting that my connection to certain criminal elements had somehow influenced the investigation. but without proof. It came across as desperate character assassination rather than legitimate legal strategy. Pause. The verdicts were delivered on a cold Tuesday morning in March. Victoria Sterling, guilty on all counts, sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. James Richardson, guilty on all counts, sentenced to life without possibility of parole due to the aggravated nature of his crimes and his role as the primary architect of the conspiracy. As the judge read the sentences, I felt a deep satisfaction settle in my chest like warm whiskey. Justice had been served, but more importantly, my enemies had been crushed so completely that they would never pose a threat to anyone again. But their legal punishment was just the beginning. Over the months between their arrests and trial, I'd been busy ensuring that their suffering extended far beyond their prison sentences. The beauty of systematic revenge lies not in the dramatic gesture, but in the careful orchestration of 1,000 small cruelties that accumulate like interest in a bank account. While Victoria and James sat in their respective prison cells, I spent months methodically destroying every aspect of their former lives. Victoria's family had disowned her within days of her arrest, her socialite mother going so far as to take out a full-page ad in the New York Times denouncing her daughter's actions and expressing support for me as the true victim of the situation. Her trust fund, worth several $1 million, was frozen pending civil litigation, which my attorneys assured me would tie up the money for decades. But financial ruin was just the appetizer. I used my connections in the media to ensure that every embarrassing detail of Victoria's crimes stayed in the public eye. Magazine articles about her double life appeared regularly, complete with unflattering photographs and interviews with former friends who painted her as a manipulative sociopath. Her reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that even women in federal prison treated her as a pariah. James's destruction was more personal, reflecting the deeper nature of his betrayal. His wife divorced him immediately after his conviction, taking their 2 young children and disappearing into witness protection after receiving several anonymous threats. His parents, both respected academics, were forced to retire early when the scandal made their positions untenable. His brother's law firm lost clients simply by association with the Richardson name. I also made sure that both Victoria and James understood that their reach extended far beyond the walls of their respective prisons. Victoria's cellmate was a woman named Rosa Gutierrez, who owed her brother's life to a favor from Uncle Victor. Rosa made sure that Victoria's daily existence was a masterclass in psychological torment. Nothing violent enough to draw official attention, but constant enough to drive a sane person to the brink of madness. James's situation was more straightforward. Federal prison was full of men who understood the value of earning favor with the right people, and I made sure that the right people knew how much I would appreciate James's continued discomfort. He spent his days looking over his shoulder, never knowing when the next accident might befall him. But perhaps the cruelest touch was the letters. Once a month, I would write to each of them, describing in detail how their former lives had been redistributed to more deserving recipients. Victoria's apartment had been sold, the proceeds donated to a charity for victims of financial crimes. James's boat had been auctioned off, the money used to establish a scholarship for underprivileged students studying business ethics. Their suffering had become my personal art project, and I was nothing if not a dedicated artist. 5 years after the trial that had made me a household name, I stood in my new corner office on the 60th floor of the Kane Tower, watching the sun set over a Manhattan skyline that now included several buildings bearing my name. Richardson and Kane Securities had evolved into Kane Industries, a multinational corporation with subsidiaries spanning private security, government consulting, financial services, and real estate development. The business world knew me as Alexander Kane, the visionary entrepreneur who'd overcome personal betrayal to build one of the most successful companies in America. Forbes had put me on their cover twice, and Harvard Business School used my corporate turnaround as a case study in crisis management and strategic growth. What they didn't know was how deeply my family's traditional business had become integrated into my legitimate operations. Victor was still the official head of the Kozlov organization, but everyone understood that I was being groomed as his successor. Kane Industries provided perfect cover for money laundering, international communications, and the movement of personnel across borders. We were the most successful criminal enterprise in American history, hiding in plain sight behind quarterly earnings reports and shareholder meetings. I'd never married again, never allowed anyone close enough to threaten what I'd built. There had been women, of course, beautiful, intelligent women who were drawn to power and success. But I kept them at arm's length emotionally. The boy who'd once believed in love and trust had died in that warehouse with James's screams, and I had no interest in resurrecting him. "Mr. Kane?" My assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your 4 o'clock appointment is here. Send her in." The woman who entered was stunning, in the way that only comes from excellent genetics and unlimited resources. Tall, blonde, with the kind of sharp beauty that suggested dangerous intelligence. She wore a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, and moved with the fluid grace of a predator. "Mr. Kane," she said, her slight accent revealing Eastern European origins. "I am Katerina Volkov. I represent certain business interests in Moscow." "Miss Volkov." I gestured for her to take a seat, across from my desk. "Your reputation precedes you. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm here to discuss a proposition that could be mutually beneficial. Your uncle Victor suggested that our organizations might find areas of cooperation." As she outlined her proposal, a complex arrangement that would merge my American operations with her family's international network, I found myself genuinely intrigued for the first time since Victoria's betrayal. Katerina was proposing something audacious, a truly global criminal empire with legitimate businesses providing cover and legitimacy. "There is one concern my employers have raised," she said as our meeting drew to a close. "Your previous emotional entanglements proved problematic. Personal relationships can create vulnerabilities that our enemies might exploit." "I've learned from those mistakes," I assured her. "Business and emotion are incompatible. I don't intend to repeat the error of trusting anyone with my personal feelings." "Excellent." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, Mr. Kane? I thought you might be interested to know that Victoria Sterling was found dead in her cell last week. Apparent suicide, according to the official report." I felt nothing at the news, no satisfaction, no regret, just the cold acknowledgement that a chapter of my life had finally closed completely. "How tragic," I said. "Isn't it?" Her smile suggested she knew exactly who had arranged Victoria's death, and that she approved of the efficiency. "I'll have a formal proposal prepared within the week." After she left, I returned to the window, watching the city sprawl out below me like a conquered territory. Somewhere in a federal prison, James was probably wondering why he'd lived longer than Victoria, not understanding that his continued existence was simply another form of torture, hope followed by despair, repeated endlessly until his mind finally shattered completely. The game that had begun with their betrayal was finally nearing its end. But what came next would be even more ambitious, even more dangerous. With Katerina's resources and my position in the legitimate world, there would be no limit to what we could accomplish. 10 years had passed since that rainy night outside the Grand View Hotel, when I first understood the true nature of Victoria and James's betrayal. Kane Industries now dominated markets on 5 continents, our legitimate operations providing cover for the most sophisticated criminal network in history. The integration had been seamless. Government contracts gave us access to intelligence, financial services allowed us to move money without scrutiny, and our security division provided trained personnel for any situation that required a more direct approach. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant informed me that I had an unexpected visitor. James Richardson had been released on compassionate grounds. Terminal cancer, the courts had decided, was punishment enough for a man who'd already served 15 years. He looked like a ghost of his former self as he was escorted into my office, his once powerful frame reduced to skin and bones, his eyes holding the hollow look of someone who'd had his soul systematically extracted over the course of a decade and a half. "Hello, Alex," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "James, you look terrible." I didn't stand or offer him a seat. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? "I wanted to apologize. Before I die, I wanted you to know that I understand what we did to you was unforgivable." Tears ran down his gaunt cheeks. I've had 15 years to think about it, to realize how completely we betrayed someone who trusted us. I know it doesn't matter now, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. "You're right," I said calmly. "It doesn't matter now. I heard about Victoria, about what happened to her in prison." He was struggling to breathe, each word an effort. Was that you? I studied his face for a long moment, this broken remnant of the man who'd once been my partner and friend. What do you think, James? I think you became something terrible, something inhuman. His voice carried no anger, just exhausted resignation. I think we turned you into a monster. No, I corrected it gently. You revealed what I already was. The monster was always there, waiting for the right provocation to show itself. You and Victoria simply provided the necessary motivation. He closed his eyes, accepting the truth of it. My children don't know who I am. My wife remarried, changed her name. I'm going to die alone in a charity hospice and no one will mourn me. Good. Then James looked at me one last time, and I saw that he finally understood the completeness of his destruction. This wasn't just about money or betrayal. It was about the systematic eradication of everything he'd ever been or hoped to be. His legacy was nothing but shame and cautionary tales told in business schools about the dangers of greed and betrayal. I hope someday you find peace, he said as he stood to leave. I already have, I replied. This is what peace looks like for people like me. After he left, I returned to my reports, dismissing the encounter as easily as I would swat a fly. James would be dead within months, his passing unmarked and unmourned. Victoria was already 6 years in the ground, her grave unmarked and unvisited. The chapter of my life that had begun with their betrayal was finally completely closed. 20 years have passed since that night in the rain when everything changed. Kane Industries is now one of the largest private corporations in the world, with a market capitalization that rivals small nations. Our legitimate operations span every major industry, while our shadow businesses have evolved into something that would make my ancestors proud. A global network of influence, information, and power that operates beyond the reach of any single government. Victor passed away 5 years ago, leaving me as the undisputed head of what the media occasionally refers to as the most successful criminal organization never to be convicted of a crime. The transition had been seamless. By then, most people had forgotten that Alexander Kane had ever been anything other than a brilliant, if ruthless, businessman. I never married Katerina, though our professional relationship had evolved into something more complex over the years. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that I was fundamentally incapable of the kind of vulnerability that true partnership required. The capacity for that kind of trust had been carved out of me with surgical precision in a hotel parking lot 20 years ago, and I had no interest in attempting to reconstruct it. Today brought news that would have meant something to me once. James Richardson had finally died, alone in a state-funded hospice, his passing noted only in a brief obituary that listed no survivors. The cancer had been slow and agonizing, which seemed appropriate, given the nature of his crimes. I felt nothing at the news. Not satisfaction, not closure, just the mild interest one might feel upon hearing that a problem from decades past had finally resolved itself. But as I sat in my penthouse office, surrounded by the monuments to my success, I found myself thinking about the question James had asked during our final meeting, whether Victoria and I had turned him into a monster, or whether we had simply revealed what he already was. The answer, I realized, was both simpler and more complex than he'd understood. The capacity for what I'd become had always existed within me, the product of genetics, early trauma, and a family legacy that stretched back generations. But it had taken their betrayal to provide the catalyst necessary for that potential to fully manifest. In destroying them, I had discovered my true nature. In embracing that nature, I had built something far greater than anything I could have achieved as the naive businessman I'd once pretended to be. Their betrayal hadn't broken me. It had liberated me from the constraints of conscience and sentiment that had been holding me back from my full potential. The boy who'd believed in friendship and love was long dead, buried under layers of calculated violence and systematic revenge. In his place stood something infinitely more powerful. A man who understood that loyalty was purchased, not given, that trust was weakness, not strength, and that the only relationships worth maintaining were those built on mutual benefit rather than emotional attachment. I'd gotten everything I'd ever wanted: wealth beyond measure, power that spanned continents, respect born of fear rather than affection. The empire I'd built would outlast me, carrying the Kozlov name forward into a future where the distinction between legitimate and criminal enterprises would become increasingly meaningless. As the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky the color of dried blood, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Victoria and James had set out to destroy me and claim my empire for themselves. Instead, they had provided the motivation necessary for me to become something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. They'd wanted to eliminate a problem. Instead, they'd created a predator. And in the end, that transformation had proven to be the greatest gift they could have given me. For that, I supposed, I should be grateful. But gratitude, like love and trust and all the other weaknesses that had once made me vulnerable, was an emotion I could no longer afford. In the world I'd built, there was only power and the will to use it. It was more than enough. It was everything.